I was returning from the weekly site inspection of our latest development in Sutton Coldfield when I saw them standing at my estate gates. For 30 years, I hadn't laid eyes on Patricia and James Sullivan, my own siblings, and there they were, huddled together like supplicants at a church door. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my Range Rover so tightly I thought I might crack the leather. You know, love, when someone cuts you out of their life completely. You imagine that first meeting back might be different. Maybe you'd run into them at the supermarket, or perhaps at a mutual acquaintance's funeral. You don't expect them to turn up at your private estate after 3 decades of silence, looking like they've aged 20 years in the past 5. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine idling, watching them through the wrought iron gates I'd had custom made in Yorkshire. Patricia, still tall and angular at 63, fidgeted with her handbag, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. James, my younger brother at 60, had put on considerable weight and lost most of his hair. Neither of them looked like the successful professionals they'd claimed to be when they'd systematically erased me from family gatherings 3 decades ago. The security system chimed softly as I pressed the remote. The gates began their slow swing open, and I watched their faces change from uncertainty to something that looked almost like relief. That should have been my first warning. When people who've treated you like dirt suddenly look relieved to see you, they want something. I pulled up the circular drive, the same drive where I'd hosted charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands for local children's homes. The drive where successful business partners had shaken my hand and called me brilliant. Now it was hosting the 2 people who'd once told our parents I was an embarrassment to the family name for choosing construction over their precious white-collar careers. Diana, Patricia said as I stepped out, her voice carrying that same condescending tone I remembered. Even after 30 years, even standing at my gates asking for God knows what, she still managed to sound like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. Patricia, James. I kept my voice level, professional. The same tone I used with difficult contractors who thought they could shortchange Diana Sullivan Construction. This is unexpected. James cleared his throat, a sound I remembered from childhood when he was about to lie to our parents. We know it's been a long time, Di, but we're family. We need to talk, family. The word sat between us like a stone thrown into still water. Family doesn't exclude you from weddings because your calloused hands might embarrass them in the photos. Family doesn't forget to invite you to Christmas dinner for 3 decades running. Family doesn't tell their children that Aunt Diana is too busy with her little projects to attend birthday parties. Do you now? I said, pulling my keys from my handbag, a handbag that cost more than James's car, though I wasn't petty enough to mention it. And what exactly do we need to discuss that couldn't be handled with a phone call? Assuming you still have my number, of course. The look that passed between them was everything I needed to know. Panic, calculation, desperation. I'd seen it 1,000 times in my business dealings. People who'd painted themselves into a corner and needed someone with deeper pockets to paint them a way out. It's complicated, Patricia said, glancing around at the landscaped grounds, the stone facade of my home, the 3-car garage where my vehicles sat. I saw her taking inventory, calculating value, just like she probably did with bank assets in her MBA career. Could we perhaps go inside? It's rather personal. Everything about my exclusion from their lives had been personal. Every family photo I wasn't in, every holiday celebration I spent alone, every milestone of my nephews and nieces that I learned about through village gossip, all of it intensely, brutally personal. But I was curious now. After 30 years of radio silence, what crisis was big enough to bring them to my doorstep? Of course, I said, walking toward the front door. Though I should warn you, I have a conference call with architects in London at 4. So whatever this is about, you'll need to make it quick. As I unlocked the door and led them into the marble-floored foyer, I caught Patricia's sharp intake of breath. The crystal chandelier I'd imported from Venice cast rainbow patterns across the walls. Original paintings, not prints, mind you, but actual original works by local artists I'd discovered and supported, lined the hallway. Through the archway they could see into the sitting room with its view of the perfectly manicured gardens. This was the home of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. Someone who'd taken every slight, every dismissal, every cruel word they'd ever spoken and used it as fuel to create something magnificent. And now, after 30 years, they needed something from the sister they'd thrown away like yesterday's rubbish. The question was, what exactly had gone so wrong in their perfect, respectable lives that they'd swallowed their pride enough to come here? I led them into my sitting room, watching as their eyes swept over the handcrafted furniture, the Persian rugs, the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked my private lake. 25 years ago, when I'd bought this derelict Victorian estate for a song, everyone in the village had called me mad. Diana Sullivan's finally lost it, they'd whispered. Thinks she can restore that old wreck. Well, that old wreck was now worth more than £3 million, and I'd done every bit of the restoration work through my own company. Not that Patricia and James would know that. They'd stopped paying attention to my life the moment I'd announced I was leaving university to start my own construction business. Tea? I offered, settling into my favorite armchair, the one positioned to catch the afternoon light streaming through the west-facing windows. Or perhaps something stronger? You both look like you could use it. Patricia perched on the edge of the sofa like she might bolt at any moment. James slumped into the cushions, his suit wrinkled and his shoes scuffed. These weren't the polished professionals I remembered from 30 years ago. These were people who'd hit hard times and were looking for a lifeline. Tea would be lovely, Patricia said, then immediately contradicted herself. Actually, perhaps something stronger. It's been a difficult few months. I poured 3 glasses of 20-year-old Macallan, the good stuff I usually reserved for celebrating major contracts. Something told me this conversation would require premium alcohol to get through. So, I said, handing them their glasses and settling back into my chair. 30 years of silence, and now here you are in my sitting room. I'm curious, what finally prompted this reunion? Did someone die? James nearly choked on his whiskey. God, no. Everyone's fine. Well, mostly fine. Mom and Dad are in their late 80s, but managing well enough in the retirement home. The retirement home. I let that sink in. How long? 5 years now, Patricia said quietly. Dad's mobility isn't what it was, and Mom, well, she needs more care than we could manage. 5 years. For 5 years, our parents had been in care, and neither of them had thought to inform their third child. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a message passed through mutual acquaintances. I'd found out 6 months ago through Margaret Hensley at the post office, who'd mentioned it in passing while I was collecting a registered delivery. I see. I took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth burn away the sharp edges of old pain. And they're well? Happy? As well as can be expected, James said. The place is expensive, though. £1,500 per week, each. Between their pensions and what savings they had. He trailed off, but I could read between the lines. Our parents' middle-class teacher salaries had provided a comfortable living, but hadn't left them wealthy. The kind of care facility that charged £3,000 per week would eat through anyone's savings quickly. I'm sure between the two of you, with your successful careers, you've managed to cover the shortfall, I said mildly. The look that passed between them was pure panic. Patricia set down her glass with shaking hands. Diana, I need to be honest with you. About everything. About why we're here. About what's happened to us. I'm listening. Though truthfully, I was starting to piece it together myself. The expensive care home fees, the desperate look in their eyes, the 30-year gap between cutting me off and suddenly wanting to reconnect. It didn't take a mathematics degree to work out the equation. "You know I work in banking," Patricia began. "Worked, past tense. The divorce? Gerald took everything. The house, the investments, even my pension contributions. Apparently, he'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts for years, building up legal fees to destroy me in court. I'd met Gerald exactly once. At their wedding 28 years ago. The wedding I'd only been invited to because our mother had insisted. He'd struck me as the sort of man who smiled too much and shook hands too firmly, the type who'd sell his own grandmother if the profit margin was right. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Whatever else had happened between us, I wouldn't wish a vindictive divorce on anyone, and James— Patricia glanced at her brother, who was staring into his whiskey like it might provide answers to life's problems. "Tell her, James." He looked up, and I saw something I'd never seen in my confident younger brother's face before. Complete defeat. "The law practice failed," he said simply. "Took on a case that was bigger than I could handle. Commercial fraud, multi-million-pound lawsuit. I thought I could manage it, thought it would make my reputation. Instead, it destroyed everything. The malpractice insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I lost the practice, the house, everything. When?" I asked. 18 months ago. 18 months. Both of them had been struggling for over a year, and it had taken them this long to swallow their pride enough to approach me. The sister they'd written off as a failure, as an embarrassment to the family name. I stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the grounds I'd landscaped myself, the lake where I'd installed a small dock and kept a rowing boat for peaceful mornings. Everything I could see I'd built with my own hands and determination. Everything I'd achieved I'd done without them. "So let me understand this correctly," I said without turning around. "Both of you are essentially bankrupt. Our parents need expensive care that you can't afford. And after 30 years of treating me like I don't exist, you've decided that perhaps your construction worker sister might be worth knowing after all." The silence stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the seconds. "It's not like that," Patricia said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. I turned back to face them. "Isn't it?" James found his voice. "Diana, we know we haven't been good siblings to you, but we're desperate. Mom and Dad's care costs are eating through everything we have left. We need help. You need money." "Yes," he said simply. "We need money." Finally, some honesty. After 30 years, some actual truth between us. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I walked back to my chair, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood behind it, my hands resting on the high back, looking down at these two people who shared my blood, but had chosen to share nothing else with me for 30 years. "Tell me," I said, "do you know what I do for a living? I mean really know, not just something with construction, the way you used to dismiss it at family gatherings." Patricia shifted uncomfortably. You build things, houses. I build dreams," I corrected her. "I take families who've been told they'll never afford their own home, and I make it happen. I specialize in sustainable housing developments for first-time buyers, affordable luxury for working families. I employ 47 people full-time and provide apprenticeships for young people who can't afford university." I moved to the mantelpiece where I kept photos of my completed projects. Not personal photos. I'd learned long ago that business achievements were more reliable company than family memories. Last year, Diana Sullivan Construction turned over £4.2 million, I continued. We've won awards for innovation, for environmental consciousness, for community development. The business I started with a £2,000 loan from the bank is now one of the most respected construction companies in the West Midlands. James was staring at me like I'd told him I'd discovered a cure for cancer. $4.2 million, I corrected. Precision matters in business, James. something you might have learned if your law practice had survived. It was cruel, but 30 years of accumulated hurt doesn't dissolve with one afternoon of whiskey and forced politeness. Patricia found her voice. We had no idea you'd been so successful. How could you? You made it clear 30 years ago that my life wasn't worth your attention. I moved to another photo. This one showing the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a housing development I'd built specifically for young families. Do you know what I remember most about my 21st birthday, Patricia? She shook her head, though I saw recognition dawning in her eyes. I remember standing in the kitchen at home, watching you and James and our parents plan the surprise party they were throwing for you the following month when you turned 21. I remember asking if I could help, and Mum saying, "Oh, darling, we want it to be special for Patricia." You understand? And I did understand. I understood that my 21st had passed 3 weeks earlier without so much as a card from any of you. The memory still stung, even after all these years. Not because of the missed party, but because of what it represented. The moment I'd realized I would always be the afterthought. The disappointing daughter who'd chosen manual labor over professional respectability. "Diana," Patricia started. But I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. Do you remember telling your friends at university that you were an only child? Because Sarah Mitchell's daughter was at Cambridge the same time as you, and she mentioned it to her mother, who mentioned it to me at the post office." Imagine my surprise to discover I'd been erased from existence. Patricia's face had gone white. That was a long time ago. It was. Just like it was a long time ago when James told his law school friends that he came from a family of educators, professionals who understood the value of intellectual achievement. No mention of the sister who was learning to read architectural plans and building codes. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, magazine articles, business awards, photos from charity events. 30 years of achievements, 30 years of building something meaningful. Would you like to know what I've been doing while you've been pretending I don't exist? I asked, spreading the documents across the coffee table. 5 years ago, I endowed a scholarship fund for young women entering trades. It's provided education and training for 47 girls who couldn't afford it otherwise. I laid out another set of photos. 3 years ago, I bought and renovated 12 derelict houses in Birmingham's inner city, then sold them at cost to first-time buyers. I lost £60,000 on that project, but 11 families who'd been living in council flats now own their own homes. James was leaning forward, studying the articles. This is incredible, Di. You've built something amazing." "Don't call me Di," I said sharply. "You lost the right to use pet names 30 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy with accumulated guilt and resentment. I could see them both trying to process the scale of what they'd dismissed, the success they'd ignored, the sister they'd underestimated so completely. "Why?" Patricia asked finally. "Why did you never try to bridge the gap between us?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Bridge the gap? "Patricia, I sent Christmas cards for 15 years. 15 years of cards that went unanswered. I sent baby gifts when your children were born, gifts that were never acknowledged. I tried calling when Dad had his heart attack 8 years ago, and James hung up on me before I could even ask how he was doing. That last one hit home. I saw James flinch, saw the memory of that phone call playing across his face. I stopped trying," I continued, "because I realized you didn't want a relationship with me. You wanted the idea of me gone completely. Well, congratulations. You succeeded. For 30 years, you've lived your lives as if Diana Sullivan never existed." I gathered up the photos and articles, putting them back in the folder with practiced efficiency. "Until now," I said, fixing them both with a steady look. "Now you need something from the ghost you created. The question is, why should I give it to you?" The clock chimed 3:30. In 30 minutes, I had a conference. Call with the architectural firm designing my next project. Eco-friendly housing development that would provide homes for 60 families. I had 30 minutes to decide whether these two people, these strangers who happened to share my DNA, deserved any part of the life I'd built without them. I sat back down, this time choosing the chair that put me directly across from them. In business negotiations, I'd learned that positioning matters. I wanted to see their faces clearly when they told me exactly what they expected from me. Before we continue, I said, I need to understand something. How exactly did you find out about my success? Because 30 years of complete disinterest suggests you weren't keeping tabs on my achievements. Patricia had the grace to look embarrassed. Margaret Henderson. Her daughter works for one of your subcontractors. She mentioned seeing your photo in the Birmingham Business Journal last month. Of course. The article about my latest project being shortlisted for a National Sustainability Award. In a community like ours, news travels faster than gossip, and gossip travels at light speed. So you discovered I wasn't the failure you'd all written me off as, and suddenly remembered, you have a sister. I leaned back, studying their faces. How convenient. James set down his empty glass with hands that trembled slightly. Diana, I know how this looks. I know we haven't earned the right to ask you for anything. But our parents, I interrupted, made their choices just as clearly as you did. Do you know what happened when I tried to visit Dad in the hospital after his heart attack? The one where James hung up on me? They both shook their heads. I drove straight there from a job site in Coventry. Didn't even stop to change out of my work clothes. I was covered in plaster dust and paint, but I was terrified he might die before I could see him. The memory still had the power to hurt, even after 8 years. Your mother took one look at me and told the nurses I wasn't immediate family, said only her real children were allowed in the intensive care unit. Patricia gasped. She wouldn't have. She did. I spent 6 hours in that waiting room, and when visiting hours ended, I drove home having never seen him. The next day, when I called to ask about his condition, you told me it wasn't my concern anymore, James. You said I'd made my choice when I'd chosen manual labor over family. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them both trying to reconcile their memories with this version of events, trying to find a way to make themselves the victims in a story where they'd been the architects of cruelty. We were protecting them, Patricia said weakly. You have to understand, Diana, they were so disappointed when you left university. When you started the construction business, they felt like they'd failed as parents. So their solution was to pretend I'd never existed? They thought? We all thought it would be easier, less painful. For whom? I asked, because it wasn't less painful for me. I stood and walked to the window again, needing to look at something I'd built, something I controlled. Outside, the gardener was trimming the hedge maze I'd designed myself, another project people had called foolish until they saw the finished result. Do you know what the hardest part was? I said without turning around. It wasn't the exclusion from birthdays or holidays. It wasn't even missing your children's milestones, though that broke my heart every single time. It was the realization that everything I'd been told about family, about blood being thicker than water, about unconditional love, was a lie. I turned back to face them. You taught me that family is conditional, that love has fine print. That acceptance comes with terms and conditions that can be revoked without notice. Diana, please, James started, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. You want to know what saved me? What kept me from drowning in the isolation you created? Work, building things, creating homes for people who appreciated them, employing people who respected what I could do rather than dismissing what I chose to do. I moved to another photo on the mantelpiece, this one showing me with my crew at the completion of my first major project 15 years ago. 12 people who'd believed in my vision when my own family wouldn't even acknowledge my existence. These people became my family. Margaret Foster, my site foreman, held my hand through 2 miscarriages because I had no one else. David Chen, my architect, walked me down the aisle when I married Tom Sullivan. Yes, I was married for 4 years to a wonderful man who died of cancer. Another milestone you missed because you weren't there to miss it. Patricia was crying now, quiet tears that did nothing to move me. Tears were easy. 30 years of consistent cruelty was hard. Tom's funeral, I continued, was attended by over 200 people, clients whose homes I'd built, employees whose livelihoods I'd created, suppliers who'd become friends, community leaders who respected my work. The only family there was the family I'd chosen because the family I'd been born into had made it clear I wasn't worth their time. James was staring at his hands. "We didn't know you'd been married." "Of course you didn't. How could you know anything about my life when you'd worked so hard to pretend it wasn't happening?" The conference call with London was in 15 minutes. I needed to make a decision about these people, about whether the past could ever be reconciled, about whether I owed anything to the DNA we shared. "Tell me exactly what you want from me," I said, sitting back down and fixing them both with the same direct stare I used in business meetings. No euphemisms, no dancing around the subject. "What exactly are you asking for?" Patricia and James exchanged glances, and I saw them having an entire conversation without words. The kind of sibling telepathy I'd never been included in. Finally, Patricia spoke. "The care home costs £6,000 per month for both of them. Between what's left of their savings and pensions, we can cover about half of that. We need help with the other $3,000 per month. Per month. For how long?" Another exchange of glances. "We don't know. Could be years." I did the mathematics automatically. £36,000 per year, potentially for many years. They weren't asking for a loan. They were asking me to become a permanent financial provider for parents who'd disowned me and siblings who'd erased me from existence. The audacity was breathtaking. The desperation was obvious. The question was, what was I going to do about it? My phone buzzed with a reminder, 5 minutes until the London call. I glanced at it, then back at my siblings. These strangers who'd appeared at my gates with 30 years of neglect and a desperate need for my money. "Excuse me for a moment," I said, standing. "I need to take this call. It's about a project that will house 60 families who currently live in substandard conditions. I'm sure you understand that some commitments take priority." I saw the barb hit home. Patricia flinched, and James looked like I'd slapped him. I went to my study and closed the door, but I could hear them through the walls, urgent whispers. The kind of desperate planning that happens when people realize they've miscalculated badly. Good. Let them worry. Let them experience a fraction of the uncertainty I'd lived with for 30 years, wondering if I'd ever see my family again. The call with the architects went well. The Eco Homes project was ahead of schedule and under budget, which meant we could add additional features: solar panels, rainwater collection systems, community garden spaces. 60 families would have homes that cost them less to run and gave their children safe places to play. When I returned to the sitting room 25 minutes later, Patricia and James were sitting in uncomfortable silence. Their glasses were empty, and they both looked like they'd been discussing whether to wait or flee. "Sorry about that," I said, settling back into my chair. "Where were we?" "Ah, yes. You need £3,000 per month for parents who disowned me, to be provided by a sister you pretended didn't exist." "When you put it like that," James started, "how else should I put it? Those are the facts, aren't they?" I poured myself another small whiskey. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Patricia, about protecting our parents from the pain of having a daughter who chose construction over their expectations." She nodded hopefully, like she thought I might be coming around to their point of view. "It's fascinating," I continued, "because it suggests that love is something that has to be earned through approved life choices. That parental affection comes with terms and conditions. That family membership requires passing certain tests. I took a sip of whiskey and watched their faces. Tell me, do either of your children know they have an aunt? The silence stretched so long I thought they might not answer. We told them you lived far away, Patricia said finally. That you were busy far away. How poetic! I laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I live 12 miles from where you raised your children, Patricia. 12 miles might as well be 12,000 when you're actively concealing someone's existence. James cleared his throat. Diana, our children are adults now. They have their own lives, their own families. This is about Mom and Dad, is it? Because it seems to me it's about a great deal more than that. I set down my glass and leaned forward. Let me tell you what I think this is really about. I think you've spent 30 years believing your own story. That I was the family disappointment, the one who chose wrong, the sister who wasn't worth knowing. And now you've discovered that while you were telling yourselves that story, I was building something extraordinary. I gestured around the room, at the evidence of success they couldn't ignore. You're not just here because you need money, though you certainly do. You're here because discovering my success has forced you to confront the possibility that you were wrong about me. That maybe the family disappointment wasn't me at all. Patricia's face had gone pale. That's not... We never thought, didn't you? Then explain to me how two people with advanced degrees and professional careers are sitting in my home, asking for financial help from the sister they once called an embarrassment to the family name. The clock chimed 4:30. Outside, the October light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the grounds I'd landscaped with my own vision and my own money. I've been thinking, I said, about what family really means. Not the fairy tale version where blood automatically creates unbreakable bonds, but the real version. The version where family is the people who show up, who support your dreams, even when they don't understand them, who celebrate your successes and comfort your failures. I stood and walked to my desk, pulling out a different folder. This one contained letters, dozens of them, written over 30 years and never sent. Do you know what's in here? I asked, holding up the folder. Letters. Birthday cards I wrote, but never sent, because I knew they'd be thrown away unread. Christmas wishes. Congratulations on your children's births, their graduations, their weddings. Condolences when Patricia's mother-in-law died, when James lost that big case early in his career. 30 years of caring about people who'd made it clear my caring wasn't welcome. I let the weight of that sink in, watching as they realized the full scope of what they'd rejected. I stopped writing them 5 years ago, I continued. Do you know why? Because Tom was dying, and I realized I was pouring emotional energy into people who'd never loved me back when I needed to focus on someone who did. Patricia was crying openly now. Diana, we're so sorry. We had no idea. You had no idea because you never asked. Never tried. Never cared enough to find out. I put the folder back in the desk drawer. But here's what I find most interesting about this whole situation. You're asking me to save our parents from the consequences of choices they made. You're asking me to rescue you from the consequences of choices you made. But none of you have ever asked what consequences I lived with because of choices you made for me. James found his voice. What do you want from us? What would it take for you to help? Finally, the right question. The one that got to the heart of everything. I want to know, I said, whether you're here because you've realized you were wrong about me or because you've realized you need something from me. I want to know whether you're asking for help or demanding tribute. And most importantly, I want to know what happens after I say yes or no to your request. I moved to the window one more time, looking out at the estate I'd built from nothing, with no family support, no inherited advantages, nothing but determination and the desperate need to prove I was worth something. Because here's what I've learned in 30 years of family exile, I said. Money doesn't buy love. It doesn't erase history. and it doesn't guarantee that the people who take it will stick around once they've gotten what they need. I turned back to face them. These two people who'd shaped my life by their absence from it. So before I make my decision, I need to know, are you here to make amends, or are you here to make a withdrawal? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. I watched their faces carefully. 30 years in business had taught me to read people's intentions in the space between their words and their expressions. James was the first to speak, which surprised me. In our childhood, he'd always let Patricia take the lead in difficult conversations. Perhaps desperation had made him braver. "I wish I could tell you we're here to make amends," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could say we've spent the last 30 years regretting our choices, missing our sister, wanting to rebuild what we destroyed." He looked up at me, and for the first time since they'd arrived, I saw something genuine in his face. But the truth is, we're here because we're desperate. Because Patricia's lost everything, and I've lost everything, and our parents need care we can't afford. The truth is, if you'd remained the struggling construction worker we thought you were, we probably never would have come. The honesty was unexpected, and somehow more devastating than any lie would have been. Patricia shot him a look of pure panic. "James, what are you doing?" "I'm telling the truth," he said firmly. "For the first time in 30 years, I'm telling our sister the truth." He turned back to me. "We didn't come here to make amends, Diana. We came here because we need money, and we discovered you have it." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not quite relief, but something close to it. After decades of wondering, of imagining scenarios where they might apologize or explain, I finally had an answer. It wasn't the answer I'd once hoped for, but it was honest. "Thank you," I said, and meant it, "for not insulting my intelligence with pretty lies about sudden family feeling." Patricia found her voice again. "That doesn't mean we don't regret how things went. That doesn't mean we don't wish things had been different. Doesn't it?" I asked. "Because regret without change isn't regret, Patricia. It's just guilt with better marketing." I walked over to the drinks cabinet and refilled my glass, taking time to think. Outside, the shadows were lengthening across the grounds, and the first lights were beginning to flicker on in the village beyond my gates. "Let me tell you what I've decided," I said, returning to my chair. "I'm not going to help pay for our parents' care." The devastation on their faces was immediate and complete. Patricia made a small sound like she'd been punched, and James actually dropped his head into his hands. "But," I continued, and watched them both look up with desperate hope, "I am going to make you an offer. Not because you're my siblings, but because I've learned something about family that you never understood." I set my glass down and leaned forward. Family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It's about showing up. It's about being present for the people who matter to you, not just when you need something from them, but consistently, reliably, over time. I paused, letting that sink in. You've never chosen to be my family. You've chosen to exclude me, ignore me, pretend I don't exist. That's fine. Those were your choices to make. But they were choices, and choices have consequences. Patricia was crying again, but quietly this time, like she was finally understanding the full weight of what they'd lost. "However," I continued, "I've had 30 years to build my own family. People who show up, people who celebrate my successes and support me through failures. People who earn the right to call me family through their actions, not their DNA." I stood and moved to yet another photo, this one from last year's company Christmas party, showing me surrounded by my employees and their families, all of us laughing at something David Chen's 5-year-old daughter had said. "These people matter to me," I said. "Their children matter to me. Their futures matter to me, and because they matter to me, I've established a trust fund that will ensure none of them ever face the kind of financial desperation you're experiencing now." I turned back to them. That trust fund currently contains £1.2 million. It provides education scholarships, emergency financial assistance, and retirement support for people who've been family to me in the ways that matter. The we numbers clearly shocked them. James's mouth actually fell open. I'm offering you the opportunity to earn inclusion in that family, I said. Not as my siblings, that ship sailed 30 years ago, but as people who might, over time, demonstrate that they understand what family really means. What would we have to do? Patricia asked, her voice hoarse. Show up, I said simply. Not for our parents, not for money, but for me. Start acting like people who care about Diana Sullivan as a person, not as a source of funds. I moved to my desk and pulled out a business card. This is Margaret Foster, my site foreman. She coordinates my company's volunteer work. We build homes for families in need, renovate community centers, teach construction skills to young people. I handed the card to Patricia. Every Saturday, we have volunteers helping with various projects. Show up. Work alongside people who've chosen to be part of my life. Learn what it means to contribute rather than just ask. For how long? James asked. For as long as it takes, I said. I'll know when I see it, when your actions prove that you value Diana Sullivan as a person, not as a bank account. I returned to my chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. If over time, you demonstrate that you've learned what family actually means, then we can discuss what help might be appropriate for our parents' care, not as an obligation based on shared DNA, but as a gift between people who've chosen to care about each other. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 30 years and the possibility of an uncertain future. It won't be easy, I warned them. Earning trust takes longer than losing it. Proving change takes longer than promising it. And there are no guarantees. I might decide, after giving you the chance, that some bridges are too burned to rebuild. Patricia looked at the business card like it was a life preserver thrown to a drowning person. What if we say no? She asked. What if we can't? What if this is too little, too late? I shrugged. Then you leave here the same way you arrived, as strangers, who happen to share my DNA. And you figure out your parents care the same way you figured out every other problem. For the last 30 years, without me. It was harsh but fair. I'd spent 3 decades learning to live without them. They could spend whatever time remained learning to live with the consequences of that choice. The clock chimed 5 o'clock. In the village, lights were coming on in windows. Families were gathering around dinner tables. Children were being called in from their play. I'd built a good life without them. The question was whether they had the courage and humility to try building one with me. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Outside, the automatic lighting system I'd installed began illuminating the pathways through my gardens, casting warm pools of light against the gathering dusk. It was a system I'd designed myself, one of dozens of small innovations I'd developed over the years that had eventually been adopted by other construction companies. Looking at it now, I realized it was a perfect metaphor for what I'd built. Light in places that had once been dark, warmth where there had been cold, guidance for people trying to find their way. Patricia was still holding Margaret Foster's business card, turning it over in her hands like it might reveal hidden instructions for rebuilding a relationship that had been dead for 3 decades. The work, she said finally. The volunteer work? What kind of things would we be doing? It wasn't acceptance, but it was the first question that suggested she might be considering my offer seriously. Right now, we're renovating 3 flats for single mothers who've escaped domestic violence situations, I said. Next month, we start building a community center for a neighborhood that's never had one. In the spring, we'll begin our annual project providing home repairs for elderly residents who can't afford professional help. I watched their faces as I described the work. Physical labor, getting dirty, working alongside people they'd probably never encountered in their professional lives. It's not glamorous, I continued. You'll come home exhausted, with paint under your fingernails and plaster dust in your hair. You'll work next to teenagers who left school at 16, immigrants who barely speak English, ex-offenders trying to rebuild their lives. People your old social circles would probably find unsuitable. James was listening intently, and I saw something I'd never seen in his face before. Genuine interest rather than barely concealed condescension. These people, he said slowly, they matter to you. Really matter. More than my biological family ever did, I said without hesitation. They've earned the right to matter through their actions. Patricia set the business card on the coffee table between us, but she didn't push it away. If we do this, she said, if we try, there's no guarantee you'll ever help with Mom and Dad's care. You might decide we're not worth forgiving. That's correct. And even if you do decide to help eventually, it won't be immediate. They need help now. Also correct. She looked at James, and I saw another of those silent communications pass between them. The difference this time was that I could read it. They were weighing pride against desperation, the humiliation of manual labor against the reality of their parents' needs. How long do you think Mom and Dad have? James asked quietly. It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about. Our parents were 87 and 85 in care, probably with limited time remaining. If I was going to have any relationship with them before they died, it would have to happen relatively soon. But I'd learned not to make decisions based on deadlines created by other people's poor planning. I don't know, I said honestly. But I know this. If you're only willing to show up for me because you need something from me, then nothing has really changed. You'll still be the people who exclude family members when it's convenient and include them when it's profitable. I stood and walked to the window one more time, but this time I wasn't looking at my gardens. I was looking at the lights in the village beyond, thinking about all the people whose lives I'd touched through my work, all the families whose homes I'd built, all the young people I'd trained and mentored. I've spent 30 years building something meaningful, I said. Not just the business, but relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. People who've proven they care about me as a person, not as a resource to be exploited. I turned back to face them. If you want to be part of that, you have to earn it the same way everyone else did. Through consistency, reliability, and genuine care. There are no shortcuts, no special treatment, because you happen to share my DNA. Patricia picked up the business card again. Margaret Foster, Saturday mornings, 8 o'clock, I confirmed. Dress for getting dirty. Bring work gloves if you have them, though she'll provide them if you don't. And you'll be there? I'm there every Saturday. I'm not traveling for business. Have been for 15 years. James leaned forward. Diana, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I nodded. Is there any part of you that wants us to succeed? Any part that would be happy to have us as family again? Or are you just offering this as a way to prove to yourself that we haven't changed? It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. I don't know, I said after a long moment. I genuinely don't know. 30 years ago, I would have done anything to have my family back. 20 years ago, I still held out hope that something might change. 10 years ago, I was angry enough that I would have enjoyed watching you fail. I sat back down, feeling suddenly tired. Today, I'm curious. Curious enough to offer you a chance I never thought I'd offer. But I can't promise you what the outcome will be, because I don't know myself. Patricia and James exchanged one more look, and I saw them reach some kind of decision. We'll be there, Patricia said, picking up the card and putting it in her purse. Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Both of us, James confirmed. I nodded. Good. Margaret will explain what needs doing and provide whatever training you need. The only rule is that you show up consistently. If you're going to do this, commit to it. Don't waste everyone's time with half measures. They stood to leave, and I walked them to the door. At the threshold, Patricia turned back. Diana, I need you to know. What we did to you, excluding you all those years, it was wrong, terribly wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I know it was wrong. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the successful banker she'd once been, but a woman who'd lost everything and was finally being forced to confront the cost of her choices. Knowing it was wrong is the first step, I said. Proving you've changed is the second. We'll see how far you get. I watched them walk to their car, a 10-year-old Ford that had seen better days, so different from the luxury vehicles they'd driven in their prosperous years. As they pulled away from the gates, I wondered if I'd ever see them again, or if Saturday morning would come and go without them. But for the first time in 30 years, I found myself hoping they'd surprise me, not because I needed them in my life. I'd built a perfectly good life without them. But because everyone deserves a chance to prove they can change, even people who've spent 3 decades proving they can't. The gates closed behind them with their familiar soft clang, sealing me back into the sanctuary I'd built with my own hands and my own heart. Whatever happened next, I'd face it the same way I'd faced everything else for 30 years, with determination, dignity, and the support of the family I'd chosen for myself. But as I walked back toward my beautiful, empty house, I found myself wondering what Saturday morning might bring. That concludes today's story. If you found value in this grandmother's experience, please subscribe for weekly stories that teach, inspire, and connect us all. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.